Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see so many of you here this afternoon. Welcome to the S.T. Lee Distinguished Annual Lecture, organized by RSIS in NTU. For information, the S.T. Lee Distinguished Annual Lecture Series was established in 2007. It's funded by an endowment established from a generous personal donation by the late Dr. Lee Seng Tee, who was a well-known Singaporean philanthropist, and a matching grant from the Singapore government was also involved. Dr. Lee was a prominent benefactor of local and overseas educational establishments, including NTU, which of course RSIS is part of NTU. The S.T. Lee Distinguished Annual Lecture Endowment enables RSIS to invite renowned international scholars and policymakers to speak to a Singapore-wide audience and other friends, of course, on the key strategic issues of our time. So today, we are extremely fortunate to have with us one such very eminent scholar to be speaking to us. It's with great pleasure that I introduce today's distinguished speaker, Professor Chung-In Moon, who is the James Laney Distinguished Professor at Yonsei University and Vice Chairman of APLN, which stands for Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. I understand that Prof. Moon is also a Vienna-based Global Neighbors Fellow, so we are very honored and pleased that Prof. Moon can join us this afternoon. A little more on Prof. Moon's background. He is also the Krauss Distinguished Fellow at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego, and editor-in-chief of the journal Global Asia, which later Prof. Moon will show you because he has a copy here. I must add that Prof. Moon has had an illustrious career in government. Between 2017 and 2021, he was a special advisor to the President of the Republic of Korea for Foreign Affairs and National Security. Prof. Moon has also been Ambassador for International Security Affairs of the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Chairman of the Presidential Committee on the Northeast Asian Cooperation Initiative. Prof. Moon was also a special delegate to the first, second, and third Korean summits held in Pyongyang between 2000 and 2018. He also possesses, of course, significant academic achievements. He was chairman of the prestigious Sejong Institute from 2021 and 2023, and dean of the Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University. He has published over 60 books and 300 articles in edited volumes and scholarly journals. This afternoon, Prof. Moon will be talking on the topic, Thinking the Unthinkable, East Asia without the US and the South Korean experiences. His lecture examines the implications of an East Asian regional realignment away from the US and the possible rise of a new security architecture and a common zone of prosperity in East Asia from a South Korean perspective. Indeed, Prof. Moon's lecture is timely and addresses the dual phenomena of growing multipolarity within the international system, as well as the growing assertiveness of states that seek greater agency from the confines of great power influence. I have no doubt that Professor Moon's S.T. Lee Distinguished Lecture on the subject of Thinking the Unthinkable, East Asia without the US and the South Korean experiences will be a source of great interest to all of us here this afternoon who want to find out more about how East Asian states are navigating the current rapidly changing and, as we know, tumultuous global environment. So with that, may I invite Professor Moon to deliver his address, please.
Ramakrishna, thank you very much for a wonderful introduction. And I'm very grateful to the Nanyang Technological University for inviting me as S.T. Lee in the lecture speaker series. And I'm very honored. And I gave, 2 lectures already, before this main event. And I was very impressed by the degree of intellectual curiosity and sharpness of questions and comments from the floor. Okay. And I will cherish my memory with the Nanyang Technological University to a great extent. And I really had to, I have been staying here in Singapore for 10 days, and for 10 days was very memorable for me and my wife. before I give a lecture, one notice, I publish a magazine, journal, quarterly journal called Global Asia, and I'm a founding editor-in-chief, and I'm still serving as editor-in-chief. And if you're interested in getting this in a journal for free, at least for 2 years, okay, you can write down your name and email address at the registration desk. And I will ask my staff to send you the quarterly journal online for free. And I was told that only 2 years. After 2 years, you may have a firewall. Okay, please keep that in mind, and maybe you can circulate around. And let me get to the point. I was in Europe last year for 2 months, mostly in Vienna, but I've been traveling in the Schengen Treaty countries. And I asked what kind of topic they are interested in getting from me. And I've given North Korean nuclear issue, big power politics in Northeast Asia, and etc. But their most frequent topic is South Korea without the US, East Asia without the US. That was a hot topic. Another interesting topic which I encountered while I was visiting Europe was revival of Antonio Gramsci. You may all know the neo-Marxian philosopher in Antonio Gramsci. He's the founder of Italian Communist Party. All of a sudden, his early remarks in 1936 has become very, very hot topic throughout Europe. In his prisoner's notebook, he said, old order is dying, new order is struggling to be born. In this interregnum, there is a time for monsters and morbid symptoms. Therefore, they are talking about Putin, Netanyahu, Trump, and all others. It's a time for, according to Antonio Gramsci, monsters. Okay? And it's a really morbid symptoms. And we do not know which new order will come out. The central to this debate is the role of the United States. Therefore, in Europe, whole debate is after 3 years, when Trump is gone, will the US come back to normalcy and become champion of a liberal international order? Some people say yes, but others say no. There will be no revival of old America. There will be change in America. MAGA will continue to, working in the American politics. Even if Democratic Party regain the political power, it will be really influenced by this MAGA drive, okay, protectionism, some form of isolation, and etc. And in fact, that debate is now also taking place in this part of the world too. But perhaps the most dependent country on the US in East Asia must be South Korea. Okay. Some people say that Japan, but in the case of South Korea, we have 26,000 American forces in South Korea. American commander in South Korea have wartime operational control over the 500,000 South Korean forces. Okay. And also from spiritual point of view, we Koreans think that there's a totally hopeless if United States leaves South Korea. Therefore, there is a kind of absolute dependency of South Korean people on the United States. Therefore, the status of United States and its future role will be vital to the peace and security and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula. That has become one big issue. But for South Koreans, the United States is really everything. Okay, United States was a liberator. United States liberator of Korean Peninsula from Japanese colonial domination. America was the incubator of free market and democracy in South Korea. South Korean constitution was greatly influenced by the American Constitution. United States was a protector and bulwark of Korea. Okay? United States saved South Korea from North Korean communist invasion, and also since then on, United States maintained alliance with South Korea. Okay? And also United States was a benefactor, the great benefactor for us. Okay? American military assistance at one point accounted for the 90% of our defense spending. Okay? Economic assistance. Even South Korean economic success was a result of really American policy drive. United States wanted to South Korea to reduce its economic dependence on the US, including aid. Then one way of doing it, let the South Korea go for export-led growth strategy. America pushed very hard, pushing for stabilization, liberalization, and eventually turned to the export-led growth strategy. And today's South Korea's economic miracle was a product of American policy drive in early 1960s. And also, our export-driven economy was successful because we could be a member of GATT, and we could have access to American market through free riding practices. Therefore, Trump is right when Trump says that South Korea ripped up the United States. Therefore, United States was a great benefactor for us. Given all these things, America was a really benign hegemon for us. Okay, United States was our window to the world. Okay, our security, economic prosperity, and international status were to a large extent a product of American maneuver and American blessing. But things are changing, and particularly since Trump 2.0. Now there is growing skepticism on American foreign policy. Okay, we were beneficiary and America was a benefactor, but this equation began to change. Okay, then what's wrong with it? And obviously, as you all know, foreign policy, American foreign policy since Trump 2.0 has been changing. Still, we do not know which one is the correct American foreign policy. President Trump's transactional approach and his supporters' MAGA agenda of a foreign policy and national security. And also we have people like Aldrich Colby, China hawks, what they call the prioritizers. Okay? China should be number one threat. Forget about Europe and Middle East, put everything in East Asia and contain, encircle China. And also, if you look at the Republican Party structure, great majority of Republicans are still, they are obsessed with the global primacist position. America should be number one in the world. Okay. And there are still elements of neocons. Okay. But one thing is clear, so-called the liberal internationalist that has been shaping foreign policy of the Democratic Party have been on the decline. Okay? But out of this, transactional and MAGA, prioritizer, primacist, neocon, there are at least 5 competing visions of foreign policy in the United States. And we do not know what's going on. But most recently, December last year, Trump 2.0 published the National Security Strategy. And also, just last month, Pentagon published the National Defense Strategy. If you combine together, we get the very clear message. And number one priority is homeland security and Western Hemisphere. But Asia through the number two priority, much ahead of Europe. That's very unusual. But if you look at the contents of changing American policy on Asia, to many, ordinary people in Asia Pacific, is somewhat surprising. Trump 2.0's number one priority in Asia is a winning economy against China. Therefore, economic priority is number one priority. And second is the deterrence against China, particularly with regard to first island chain and second island chain. National security strategy mentioned about Taiwan, but national defense strategy barely touched on Taiwan Strait. Okay. It talked about South China Sea and first island chain and second island chain. And surprisingly, national defense strategy didn't mention about North Korea nuclear issues. Okay. Therefore, for South Koreans, it's very surprising. First of all, national security strategy did not mention about the Korean Peninsula, okay, and did not mention the nuclear issues. And the national defense strategy, they mentioned the role of South Korea within the context of creating equilibrium or balance of power against China. Therefore, Korea's supporting role for deterrence against China. Of course, there's one mention that North Korea poses, nuclear threat to the United States and its allies in the area, but only one sentence. Then all these things indicate that Trump 2.0 has a different way of understanding about the Korean Peninsula and East Asia. But as expected, Trump 2.0 has posed numerous challenges to South Korea and South Korea-U.S. bilateral relations. First signal came immediately after the Liberation Day announcement on April 1st last year. Trump imposed reciprocal tariffs to South Korea, up to 25% unilateral. And plus, he warned that the U.S. would increase its tariffs to semiconductors, medical equipment, and pharmaceutical products up to 100%. Okay. And then he came up with a counter proposal saying that if you invest the $350 billion, okay, then we may lower it to 15%. But President Trump's request of investment of $350 billion was very, very shocking, because he wants upfront cash investment. $350 billion means what? Almost 6% of South Korea's GDP. And plus, it accounts for 82% of our foreign reserve. What is worse is this. Upfront cash investment, but South Korea does not have any voice in determining where to invest. President Trump will designate the sectors and companies. Worst was that return on investment will be divided 90% going to the US, 10% going to South Korea. We were shocked, okay? It's really predation, okay? Extortion. And our negotiation team worked very hard. Particularly, President Lee Jae-myung is a very pragmatic person, but he's also a man of pride. Therefore, he couldn't accept it. Therefore, our trade minister and the national security advisor had a real hard bargaining with the United States. And the result was this: okay, we will accept the $350 billion, the amount. We'll invest that amount. But out of $350 billion, $150 billion will go to the shipbuilding sector, which Trump wanted, because Trump wanted Mashuga, making American shipbuilding industry great. And he really liked that idea, and therefore he agreed. And also we come up with really good bargaining, that as for the nature of investment in the shipbuilding industry will be decided by the private sectors of the United States and South Korea. The remaining $250 billion, and we made it very clear, given our foreign reserve situation, we cannot come up with $200 billion in upfront cash. Therefore, we'll invest $20 billion per year for 10 years time period. And as to where to invest, we'll discuss. But South Korea will try to reflect President Trump's needs. Therefore, civilian nuclear sector, energy infrastructure, and also some semiconductors. And President Trump was interested in those areas. Therefore, we'll give a lot of thought on that one. But as for profit sharing, 50-50%, only after there was a full return on our investment. Okay? And President Trump accepted it. And in return for that, he lowered reciprocal tariffs from 25% to 15%. But problem is this, when our government came up with that kind of agreement, and both sides, Washington and Seoul, did not adopt any joint statement. Instead, they come up with White House fact sheet. and fact sheet says that it is not legally binding. Since it is not legally binding, there is no need for South Korean government to push for it. And then our National Assembly was urging that as for the investment, okay, there should be special law concerning investment in the United States enacted by the National Assembly. As you all know, that legislative process is really time-consuming. And then it was delayed, and then President Trump just announced, okay, we'll return to 25% reciprocal tariff to South Korea. And just yesterday, our National Assembly passed a special law on investment in the United States. Then I think the President Trump, will maintain 15% reciprocal tariff on South Korea. Then came another issue. The American Supreme Court decided that made a verdict that this universal reciprocal tariff is illegal. And then our South Korean firms, including Hyundai Motors and Hynix and whatever, they are now thinking about going through the litigation process. Then again yesterday, the Trump administration announced that it will be investigating South Korean violation of Section 301, and particularly surplus capacity by South Korea. That is unfair trade practices. Therefore, the Trump administration will be making investigation of South Korean violation of Section 301 and accordingly impose a tariff, which was wiped out by Supreme Court decision. After going through it, and our trade and industry minister he's a very young fellow, but very smart guy. He was a technocrat, and then he became the CEO of Tucson Ability, and then recalled as a Minister of Trade and Industry. And he confessed in TV interview, I have never seen this kind of unfair, trade negotiation. It will rip up, okay? There is no element of equality here. And if our trade and industry made that kind of confession, now you can tell, what extent that the pressure from the Trump administration have been quite, tremendous. Therefore, we are not happy with Trump 2.0's push for these trade and investment issues. Then also during the summit talk between President Trump and President Lee Jae-myung on October 28th last year, they had the summit talk in Gyeongju. And the United States pushed for modernization of ROK US alliance. And the United States come up with three major demands. First demand was South Korea should increase its defense burden from current 2.68% of GDP to 5% of GDP. Okay. Within the within the tenure of President Trump, meaning was with 3 years, with 3.5 years, he want to increase South Korea. He want South Korea to increase defense spending 5% of GDP. Okay, and also we Americans maintain about 26,000 forces in South Korea and 2 wings, Air Force wings in Korea under the rubric of 7th Air Force. And we have been paying the part of the cost related to the maintenance, stationing of American forces in South Korea. It is called defense cost sharing, as opposed to defense burden sharing. Okay, and 2 years ago, the Biden administration and Yoon Suk-yeol government made an agreement. Every 5 years there was a renegotiation, and our government agreed to pay about $1 billion every year. Okay, and the rate of increase will be tied up to the inflationary rate. And it was a happy arrangement. But President Trump was criticizing it. President Biden was dumb. How could he only get to just $1 billion per year? And Trump has been wanting $10 billion per year. Okay, it's like a machineries. Okay, and American forces become kind of machinery forces, and therefore he pushed that one very hard. Okay, we want South Korean covering of defense costs related to the American forces in South Korea up to $10 billion per year. That is, therefore, monetary issue was one major issue. Another issue was related to strategic flexibility doctrine. U.S. want to bring out its forces and weapons without consultation with South Korea. In fact, U.S. has been doing it. Even U.S. did it for the past 3 days. There was a shortage of Patriot missile and the shortage of THAAD system in the Middle East, and the U.S. began to ship them out from South Korea to Middle East without notifying South Korea. But according to newspaper report, that there was a prior consultation with the our Ministry of National Defense. But United States want to make it formal that the strategic flexibility of American forces in South Korea. But South Korean government is not happy about it, because if there is a very flexible move of American forces in South Korea, they can send the wrong signal to Pyongyang. Pyongyang may make a military adventure. Therefore, South Korean government position is that it is not acceptable for the United States just to move in, move out its forces and equipment without prior consultation with South Korea and etc. That was the second issue. Third issue was President Trump want the South Korean government make a formal announcement for military support in the case of contingencies in Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. As to this one, as those 3 demands, President Lee Jae-myung was very, he was disciplined, and he said, okay, 5%, we cannot come with the 5%, but we'll increase our defense spending to 3.5% of GDP within 3 years. He has a calculation. His calculation is this: U.S. will be wanting greater defense role by South Korea. U.S. really wants South Korea to be main fighting forces in South Korea. U.S. would be supporting forces. Therefore, President Lee Jae-myung is willing to take that role. In order to do that, then there should be increase of defense spending. Therefore, he said, okay, we'll increase to 3.5%. And within 3 years. That is why, for example, Pete Hegseth and Eldridge Colby, when they give talks in Europe, they said, learn from South Korea. Not like Europe. In the case of Europe, when they talk about 5% of GDP, about 2% just increase in actual combat forces. Remainder is investment in infrastructure and etc. But over 10 years time period, South Korea, within 3.5 years, just 3.5, within 3 years, 3.5%. The US was very happy. About $10 billion per year, South Korean people's sentiment is strongly against it. Therefore, what our government did was, okay, we'll come up with about $33 billion for the period of it's a 10 years time period. Okay, but that $33 billion include all the costs related to the free rental of the land and the exemption of taxes and also free access to utilities and whatever. If add up all together, then we will be paying almost $30 billion. Therefore, $30 billion per year, either for 3 years. Therefore, it's almost $10 billion, which President Trump requested. Therefore, we matched up American demand. Strategic flexibility, President Lee Jae-myung said no, but it's currently taking place. As a formal announcement and commitment to military support in the case of contingencies in Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, our government flatly said no, we cannot do that. Okay? That was very different from previous Yoon Suk-yeol government. But if you look at all these elements, American the stance has fundamentally changed. American position is very clear. You South Koreans, you defend yourself. We may come up with just extended nuclear deterrence and some bridging capabilities. Now, South Korea, you're rich, you're strong, you have one of the best defense industry. You can handle North Korea from conventional force terms. Therefore, you guys handle it. You guys handle it by yourself. America will come up with what you are lacking: nuclear deterrence and other bridging capabilities, such as reconnaissance and surveillance and asset and etc. And our government is saying yes, but in return for that, and our government is saying that you got to transfer wartime operational control to us. Initially, America wanted to transfer, but recently, because of China factor, now field commander in South Korea is very hesitant about the transfer of wartime operational control to South Korea. But President Lee Jae-myung is very much committed to getting back the wartime operational control. Therefore, within his reign, within his tenure, I think that there will be transfer of wartime operational control. Given all these things, there is a fundamental realignment of ROK-US in alliance. Another big issue is the North Korean nuclear issue. On that one, North Korea has nuclear weapons. South Korea does not. Therefore, there is asymmetry between the North and the South. North Koreans doesn't listen to us. Okay, North Korea's primary concern is the United States. The North Korea wanted to have a nuclear arms control or a nuclear arms reduction talk with the United States. The United States has a key to the North Korean nuclear issue. On that issue, President Lee Jae-myung's approach has been very, very smart. Okay, when he visited Washington August last year, he proposed to President Trump that you be peacemaker on the Korean Peninsula. I'll be pacemaker. You know Chairman Kim Jong-un so well. Why don't you resume summit talk with Chairman Kim Jong-un, come up with some kinds of tangible outcomes? And I will support you and facilitate. That is his position. Okay. And also President Lee Jae-myung made it very clear that denuclearization might be extremely difficult. Therefore, it is very impractical for us to put the denuclearization at the entrance of any dialogue and negotiation with the United States, with North Korea. Denuclearization should be placed at the exit of dialogue and negotiation. By proposing it, Lee Jae-myung argues that then we should go freezing the incremental stage of freezing North Korean nuclear and missile activities and reducing and rolling back North Korean nuclear and missile arsenals. And then as for denuclearization, it might take a much longer time. Therefore, let us focus on freezing and reduction. President Trump seems to be sympathetic or empathetic with this view, but State Department, Pentagon, they tend to be opposed. Japanese government opposed. South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs seem to be somewhat hesitant. But again, we are hoping that when President Trump visits Beijing on March 31st, okay, we are hoping that after his summit talk with President Xi Jinping, on the way back, he might drop in Pyongyang. But now one important variable is what is happening in Iran. And we are not sure whether Kim Jong-un would welcome President Trump's visit to Pyongyang. And plus there are no visible signs that Washington has been working with Pyongyang to prepare President Trump's visit to Pyongyang. Therefore, I'm not sure. But another chance would be that in the APEC summit in November, the Shenzhen APEC summit in November, there could be another chance. But again, we are relying on the United States, particularly President Trump. He has a special tie with Chairman Kim Jong-un. And we believe, President Lee Jae-myung believes that the President Trump is perhaps, along with Putin, one of very few people who can, persuade and convince a North Korean leader. Therefore, we are counting on it. And finally, South Korea is going through South Korea is very much sandwiched between China and the United States in geopolitical arena, geo-economic arena, technology arena, and value and global governance area. Conservatives in South Korea tend to support the idea of a pro-American balancing strategy. Therefore, we take side with the hegemon rather than the challenger. That is the best way of assuring our security and prosperity. But some progressive argue that the pro-American balancing strategy may not be ideal solution. And also, if you look at the Korean past, you may recall that during Joseon Dynasty, okay, Ho-Jin, the Qing Dynasty was on the rise, Ming Dynasty was declining. But at the time, Joseon King and his gentry class made a betting on the declining Ming. And then Qing Dynasty invaded South Korea. And our king had a really humiliating moment with Hong Taiji, the second son of the founder of the Qing Dynasty. Therefore, in Korean diplomatic history, there is a most humiliating moment. Therefore, a lot of historians argue that to learn from that example, okay, China is rising, America is stagnant or declining, and it is wise for South Korea to take side with the challenger rather than declining hegemon. Therefore, bandwagoning China is good. We're that kind of people. But nationalists, both progressive and conservative. Conservative argue that we cannot rely on great power politics. We have suffered enough from great power politics. Therefore, we should be more independent. We should seek nuclear weapons. And South Korea becoming nuclear-armed middle power, then we can be freed from all this yoke of great power politics. But on the other hand, the radical progressive argue that we suffered from because of all this alliance politics or hard politics. The best way for us to assure peace, security, prosperity is to declare permanent neutrality, like Switzerland. Okay? That is so-called standing alone strategy. They have a pro-American balancing strategy, bandwagoning China strategy, and standing alone strategy. But most popular strategy, I would say that because I conduct some opinion survey too, about 70% of South Koreans support the continuation of status quo through muddling through. We maintain alliance with the United States while enhancing strategic cooperative partnership with China. Okay, we should maintain good relations with China and the U.S. Ideally speaking, that is the most preferable, but in reality, particularly when the Washington and Beijing are in confrontational mode, our hedging, the maneuver for the hedging will be fundamentally limited. But the Korean people in general argue that why the hell we should antagonize China? Okay, alliance is good, but China is so near to us and very powerful and prosperous. Why should we neglect or antagonize China? We should go along with China too. Therefore, and that is a tradition of really South Korean government. But that idea started with President Kim Dae-jung. He was very close to Chung-In and Clinton. And he made the maximum benefit out of those personal relationships. Then Nomuhyun, even conservative Lee Myung-bak government followed that suit. Therefore, both China and the U.S. Okay, only previous government, Yoon Suk-yeol government, took side with the United States. You may recall Park Geun-hye, the president before Yoon Suk-yeol. He attended, Beijing Victory Parade on September 3rd, 2015. And that really angered the United States. But even though Park Geun-hye was a conservative leader, he paid a lot of attention to the importance of China. Those are the kinds of the view shared by the great majority of South Koreans. But anyhow, there are ongoing debate in South Korea. But under Lee Jae-myung, and Lee Jae-myung was very friendly with President Trump, and also he was very closer to President Xi Jinping too. He's the person who made the President Xi Jinping make big smiles, okay, in the Great People's Hall. You have seen that scene, therefore, and therefore Chinese people like Lee Jae-myung very much, okay. You know the story, because President Xi Jinping gave a Xiaomi mobile phone as a gift to President Lee Jae-myung when he visited Gyeongju during APEC meeting, and then President Lee Jae-myung, joked to him saying that is the security safe, and then Xi Jinping says that there is no back door, and that is interesting case. And then when he made a return visit to Beijing in January, he took the Xiaomi phone, and then after the summit talk in Great Hall, he proposed to take a photo by the Xiaomi phone together. Therefore, President Xi Jinping and his wife, and Lee Jae-myung and his wife took a photo together by using the Xiaomi phone which President Xi Jinping gave to him as a gift. But that kind of, in a sense, made President Lee Jae-myung and Xi Jinping very close. Therefore, I think he will try to continue, that stance. And even during the presidential campaign, Lee Jae-myung came up with a very interesting argument, saying that, what he was saying that why we should be hostile to China. We should say xie xie to China, xie xie to Taiwan, and arigato to Japan. We have all the friendly relations with neighboring countries. Why should we take a hostile position? Then conservative criticize him, saying that he is pro-Chinese, he is flattering China. All the flattery diplomacy is being revealed by Lee Jae-myung. But his pragmatic foreign policy is very much anchored in that kind of attitude. Anyhow, I spent too much time, but anyhow. But after this Trump to negotiations, now American image in South Korea is changing. America is no longer a benign hegemon, but it's a predatory hegemon. Okay, really, America is ripping off South Korea, and Americans, South Koreans are not very happy when President Trump saying that, oh, you used to be very poor, but we helped you. Now you become rich, therefore you should pay back to us. That logic, South Koreans are not very happy. Okay, and also South Koreans are somewhat wary of American attitude of being very hysterical contender with China. South Koreans think that the United States is still number one. China is catching up, but a long way to go. There's no way for the U.S. to take that kind of very hysteric and pressing attitude on China. That is in a general consensus. Okay? And also, when the Trump administration began to demand too many things, particularly defense cost sharing and defense spending, then a lot of South Koreans have begun to raise, is American forces in South Korea mercenaries? How the mercenaries can have a wartime operational control? Okay? And if American troops stationed in Korea, because we gave money to them, that we are giving the U.S. protection money, then we should command American forces in South Korea. Therefore, some progressive begin to argue in that way. And therefore, overall, America has become very, very unreliable, unpredictable, uncertain. Therefore, some people now are concerned, this uncertain nature of American policy has become major liability to South Korea. All in all, the South Korea the United States is no longer an asset, but it has become liability. And how to deal with that issue? That is a big problem. In this context, now people in South Korea are thinking about unthinkable. Okay? The unthinkable means what? South Korea without the United States. Okay? But let me tell you frankly, a great majority of South Koreans think that there is no way for the U.S. to leave South Korea. After 3 years, when Trump is gone, U.S. will come back, and U.S. will show all the liberal international posture. Therefore, let us be patient and let us cater what Trump wants. Just let us be patient, just 3 years. Then we'll have another normal in the face of the United States. But that views. But a lot of pundits in South Korea argue that regardless who becomes the next president, uncertainty and unreliability of American foreign policy will continue. There will be very, very precarious status quo, okay? And therefore South Korean security will be jeopardized in the context of this very uncertain and precarious American foreign policy. And also there is a concern that there is a good chance for the U.S. withdraw its ground forces South Korea. As national defense strategy pointed out, U.S. may provide us with critical but limited support to us. That means what? Let defense of South Korea to be taken by South Korean forces. Take out American forces from South Korea. America remain as offshore balance, as John Mearsheimer has been arguing. Then U.S. come up with extended nuclear deterrence and provision of certain bridging capabilities such as reconnaissance and surveillance. And now the scholars in South Korea are betting on that possibility. But we cannot rule out the possibility of complete American disengagement. First, continuing American failure overseas, and the real revival of new isolationism with the political power of MAGA or libertarians, then America may, decide to disengage from South Korea and East Asia. Okay. And now Trump has been championing hold the sphere of influence. Okay, U.S. in charge of Western Hemisphere. Okay, Russia, Europe, Asia, China. If that kind of formula works out, then there is no reason for the U.S. continue to stay in this part of the world. There is another possibility too. Finally, if South and North Korea come up with a major breakthrough with the North Korea, okay? If South Korea comes up with a major breakthrough with North Korea, and we have a peace deal, then South Koreans may be demanding withdrawal of American forces from South Korea and termination of mutual defense treaties. Very low possibility, but we can rule out that kind of possibility. Therefore, disengagement, complete disengagement by the American initiative, which so-called creation of a new sphere of influence through mutual consensus between China and the US, or South Korean rejection of American forces. Those three possibilities. But that possibility seems to be very, very low. But one thing is clear. Now we are increasingly thinking about unthinkable. We got to prepare for the Korean Peninsula with American forces. Then what are the implications for East Asia? I think that we got to prepare for the worst, okay? And also, it is very clear. Asia minus, or East Asia minus US will not be end of the world, okay? We can still enjoy peace, prosperity, common security. Therefore, we should get out of old thinking that the US is everything for all of us, okay? I think that is the first implication. Second implication is this: the countries in the East Asia should work together to create a new security architecture. We have been relying on American-led collective defense system through alliance mechanism. Now it is time for us to think about transforming collective defense system into some sort of a collective security system anchored in United Nations charters. China has been proposing it, but China has not shown any actions toward that direction. But I think the countries in the region should really talk about this transformation of a collective defense system, which assume common enemies and common threat, into collective security system, in which there are no enemies, no common threat, common enemies and common threat. Hold the idea of a common security, comprehensive security, and comprehensive, security. And also third, and from economic front, we should push for open regionalism more than ever before. We should reactivate APEC. Okay? United States has been killing APEC. Okay? And then we can make RCEP and TPP as a companion to this APEC mechanism. Okay? We have created wonderful open regional economic frameworks, but now we are abandoning them. That's just stupidity. Nothing wrong with them, okay? And therefore, it is time for us to redirect our attention to open regionalism. Fourth, I think strategic empathy and cultural pluralism should be the very important guiding principle for all countries in the region. We should not make internal cleavages in terms of values, cultural differences, and etc. And we need to show cultural tolerance. Okay. And finally, I would like to propose this idea of transcending diplomacy. That idea was suggested by Paul Schroeder. He's a diplomatic historian who used to teach at the University of Illinois. He passed away. And by studying the Vienna Congress, 1815, and he argued that 100 years peace in Europe was a result of Vienna Congress. But Vienna Congress, which produced a set of norms, rules, principles, and procedures, were a result of middle power diplomacy rather than big power diplomacy. Okay. And I think it is time for the so-called middle countries or middle powers. The country like Singapore, you're much smaller, but Singapore has always come up with innovative ideas, soft power and whatever. But through the coalition of these middle countries or middle powers, we can come up with a new form of a transcending diplomacy, okay, that can overcome this big power rivalry and disorder in international system. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Moon. Professor Moon will now take questions with Professor Kumar as the moderator. Gentlemen, please.
Thanks very much. So Prof. Moon has given us a very comprehensive picture of this whole idea of thinking the unthinkable, how the international order, particularly the international order in East Asia, could look like without the US. He's given a Korean perspective, South Korean perspective. I mean, there are a lot of things we can talk about, but I guess one good way to start would be, I mean, your perspective, Prof. Moon, on whether or not we are, as some people argue, we are at an inflection point in terms of, you touched on this too, actually, whether or not we are ever going to see the liberal international order come back. You mentioned that some analysts in Korea and possibly elsewhere say that, well, all we have to do is just wait out Trump 2.0. Democrats will hopefully come back and, things will be back to normal. But in your own personal assessment as a scholar and analyst, right, how realistic do you see of the prospect of the old liberal international order coming back, even if, as we mentioned briefly, the Democrats secure victory and regain the White House? Is it possible? You mentioned that the MAGA influence would still be there, and is it now very much something which we have to expect that, because of this enduring, it's not so much Trump, but now Trumpism will sort of spread within the US political system, and there will be global repercussions, and we're not going to ever get the liberal international order back again. What do you think? Start off with that.
I really don't think the liberal international order is dead. It's well and alive. There is some disruption point. Okay? We are living in liberal international order, international law, international institution, international organization, international norms, even globalization. Okay? Singapore is a perfect and classical example of the product of liberal international order. If Singapore is gone, then liberal international order will be over too. Therefore now, it's not simply called institutional inertia, which Robert Cohen once described. It's a part of our life. Okay? Therefore, I think people talk about the end of liberal international order is too much premature. Because look, GATT WTO system is not working properly. But still, I would say that 90% of international trade is being done through the WTO and GATT. And the remnant of Bretton monetary system and IMF system, and IMF created the international banking and financial norms and institutions. They exist. Therefore, in the sense, my basic point is that if you talk about the death of liberal international order, it's an early epitaph to the reality, or some misplaced diagnosis existing reality. But what important thing is South Korea, Singapore, Japan, we are all the beneficiaries of liberal international order. Then we should defend it. And then sometime we might have to fight against the United States. Let's do it. And surprising, China is supporting liberal international order. Which is true. And if there also we got to show the very important lesson to the United States. If the United States does not want to be part of it, you leave. Therefore, I think we need a more bold approach. Okay, let the UN go in New York. Let us, countries, group of countries come up with a proposal. Okay, we'll host the United Nations. Without that kind of shock therapy to the United States will be never awakened from the false dream of new isolation, protectionism, mercantilism, whatever. Therefore, we are being awakened by Trump shock, but I think the United States needs to be shocked by the fresh shocks coming from the rest of us.
Thank you. Floor is open. Please feel free to briefly ask a question. There's a question here. I hope there are mics, right? Yeah, in front here. Yep. Please briefly identify yourself. Yeah.
I'm a student, Nino. I have a question regarding like the US in general, in the terms of the US dollar strength. Let me rephrase. Because in Asia, about 2/3 of all assets, international assets, are in US dollar. And in terms of liability, more than half are in terms of US dollar. And recent trends has shown, like in financial crisis or situations, the US dollar debt is not as quickly withdrawn as compared to local debt currencies being dumped. So if you're looking at it from an economic perspective, do you think our reliance on the US is overly much for us to actually be without them?
Okay, can I take one more question?
Yes.
Over here, on the left, my left. On the left here.
Thank you very much, Will James, Assistant Professor in Strategic Studies at RSIS. Thank you for a fascinating lecture. Two questions which kind of get to your last point about transcending diplomacy. I'm interested in South Korea's relationships with other US allies who face the same predicament that you've been talking about. First of all, Poland. As you know, South Korea has a blossoming relationship with Poland in defense industrial ties. Poland also now shares a border with a state that has North Korean troops on occupied territory. So does that relationship for South Korea just equal a defense industrial opportunity, or is there more of a strategic element at play there? And then relatedly, if you could also talk a bit more about the relationship with Japan and Australia as well, please, and if you think there's going to be a trilateral between the three states that would be independent of the US, but broadly supportive of the order that it's led for the last 80 years. Thank you.
As to dollar hegemony issue, dollar hegemony has been most beneficial to all countries concerned. But problem is the politicization of dollar hegemony, and particularly America's frequent resort to sanction measures utilizing the currency. That has been one of the most important problems. And China and other countries have been trying to diversify from the dollar hegemony because of that reasons. And for example, Chinese effort to digitalize its currency is another good example. But in my personal opinion, it will not be easy to divert away from American dollar hegemony. And particularly Trump administration has been extremely sensitive to any kinds of outside effort to weaken American dollar stance. Therefore, it will be very difficult for us to change it. But again, central banks in each country try to diversify risk in terms of currency, management. That kinds of rather passive adjustment to American and dollar standing seems to be the only way to handle it. Okay? Therefore, for that one, another one could be that globalization of stable coin could be another factor. But again, it is too risky for us to rely on American dollar alone. Okay? Maybe if American dollar is backed up by stable coin, there could be one option. And there could be some revolutionary change in international banking and financial systems so that they can come up with more strengthened international norms and principles and rules governing banking and financial transactions. There could be another one. But I think that the role of central banks and their cooperation would be vital to the stabilization of international currency. And as to allocate Poland issue, South Korea is very cautious about its cooperation with NATO. Conservatives in South Korea wanted to have a strategic ties with NATO. Therefore, their view is this: North Korea is helping Russia, Therefore, South Korea should have NATO. But progress in South Korea, including current incumbent government, do not think in that way. And that being the case, then we'll be internationalizing Korean conflict. We don't want the NATO and Russian forces come to Korea to have North South Korea fighting each other. Therefore, they want to, the progressive forces in South Korea want to delink the Korean Peninsula for international conflict system. Therefore, it's very cautious. Therefore, but as for this defense industrial cooperation between ROK and Poland will continue, but it's getting tougher too. Okay, because there are pressures coming from the EU countries. Okay, even NATO countries, and Poland has been requesting much more, favorable terms of payment regard to South Korea. Therefore, it is getting tougher. Okay, but by getting into Polish market, South Korea was able to expand its defense industrial cooperation with other Eastern European countries. Therefore, it was a great benefit for us. But one thing is clear, as a result of defense industrial cooperation, Warsaw and Seoul have become much closer. And they are even talking about strategic cooperative partnership. But I really don't think that the current Lee Jae-myung government will cooperate with Poland within the framework of ROK, NATO, in a strategic framework. Okay? And then that goes, for example, our President Lee Jae-myung didn't attend the NATO IP4 summit last year. This year, in July, he's likely to attend because he has other obligations in Europe. But again, the ruling party in South Korea is very cautious about NATO plus IP4. And most importantly, Trump doesn't give a shit about it. And if Trump doesn't give attention to that issue, there is no reason for South Korean president and Japanese prime minister to attend it. For example, we have a so-called, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and also we have U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral summit in a framework, and etc. Trump never convened that kind of trilateral summit. If President Trump doesn't give attention to the trilateral summit, Quad summit, or Indo-Pacific summit, and there will be very little incentive for leaders of these countries to initiate or attend that kind of meetings.
There's a question about the trilateral ROK, Japan, Australia.
Now, I think that goes again, Japan, Australia, South Korea cooperation. That was within the framework of the Indo-Pacific strategy. But in South Korea, there is a growing voice that, for example, President Lee Jae-myung is very close to Prime Minister Takaichi, okay, and both of them should talk together and include Australia and Canada, some ASEAN countries together, and we can come up with some kinds of loose coalition of middle powers in talking about security architecture and open economic regionalism, whatever. And I think South Korea will be very, very receptive to that idea. But problem is that to what extent Japan would have autonomy in pushing for this kind of trilateral or quadruple talks minus United States. Okay? Japan is still betting on the United States. Therefore, that will be the very important factor.
I do know that there are RSIS master students here because I taught some of you. So if anybody want to take the opportunity to ask Prof. Moon any question, that will be a good time. So, I always encourage them to attend. Okay, yeah, thanks.
And also behind the rear side.
That's right.
Top end.
Okay, thank you, Professor Moon. I'm an IP student of RSIS. I have a quick question. Just you mentioned SAD. So my question is also about SAD. And do you think the SAD issue between China and South Korea does the shadow still over the bilateral relations because there are still news, there are still opinions that okay, the strategic trust is still not rebuilt between the two countries. So what's your opinion on that? I also heard some new mechanism during the SAD issue. There's maybe some China-Korea joint technical verification committee. There also a proposed trilateral dialogue among China, US, and South Korea. So do you think in the future there are some new mechanisms to promote such kind of strategic cooperation between China and South Korea, maybe US? Thank you.
There was a question at the back. Okay, put up your hand higher, I can't see. All right, yes, in the center. Yeah, there's one more question.
Okay, thank you, Professor. First of all, I'm Yan Fong from Pinkerton. So my question is, since South Korea is actually aligned with US militarily, so in the event of a US-China conflict, specifically maybe about Taiwan, how would South Korea react to it, and how would it react to it? That's the first question. And also the second is, since South Korea is militarily aligned with the US, so in terms of tech, like AI and other spheres of tech-related stuff, is it also very aligned with the United States? Yeah. So that's the two questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You want to take this too?
But as for China, US, South Korea strategic cooperation, I think is unthinkable. The US will never accept that idea. But what South Korea has in mind is this. South Korea has been proposing that there should be further enhancement of China, Japan, South Korea trilateral cooperation. That, the delegates from those three countries have held 18 rounds of negotiation for the creation of trilateral FTA, but they haven't concluded it. But after President Trump pushed for the whole this trade war, and those people in Japan, South Korea and China are talking about we should expedite the process of trilateral FTA, okay? And also South Korea is trying to join CPTPP, but Japan has a very important position there. And Japan was has become receptive to South Korea's joining CPTPP, but Japan has been very hesitant about Chinese joining it. But South Korea has been, pushing Japan to give a positive thought to Chinese admission to CPTPP. There are that kinds of cooperations. But under security cooperation, we have a very strong US, Japan, South Korean trilateral security cooperation. We are holding annual military exercises and trainings, okay? Of course, under the current government, the frequency and intensity have become somewhat lowered. Therefore, there is a very, dense security cooperation, and it will be very difficult for South Korea to come up with any kinds of, trilateral or quadruple cooperation with China. However, South Korea will continue bilateral cooperation with China, and also they have decided to reactivate vice minister level talks in the Ministry of Defense and Foreign Affairs, and that's a good sign. And as for the Taiwan conflict issues, South Korea will be very difficult for South Korea to commit any kinds of military to the contingency in Taiwan Strait, because it can send a very wrong signal to North Korea. Okay, and because first of all, if South Korea support American forces or Japanese forces in the South China Sea or in Taiwan Strait, then it's very likely that Beijing will encourage Pyongyang to take a more provocative position, okay, in order to divert American forces from South China Sea or Taiwan. And also, if you look at the North Korean behavior, when there is a relative power vacuum in South Korea, North Korea tends to be more aggressive. Okay? Therefore, South Korean strategic planners link what would happen in South China Sea and Taiwan Strait with the security situation on the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, South Korean strategic position is try to delink between the two, so that we can minimize the chance of conflict on the Korean Peninsula. And also, technical issue, technology is very, very sensitive. We have been betting on the U.S. and we are in the position of providing China with advanced technology. But now things are completely changing. China is more advanced and competitive than South Korea. Okay, therefore, complete different equation. But in the case of semiconductor chips, SK Hynix and Samsung had a plant in China, and in order to produce more competitive chips, then they should upgrade their equipment in China. But U.S. has been banning, restricting South Korea make a further investment in China. There is a big problem. But for example, U.S. has been restricting the government procurement of chips coming from Dell and Apple. The now primary beneficiary will be South Korean firms. We have SK Hynix in the U.S. and Samsung in the U.S. They will be primary beneficiaries. Therefore, there is a very subtle trade-off between China and the United States. But with regard to technology, the degree of technological cooperation between China and South Korea has rather limited. Okay, America has been much more deepened, but as time goes, South Korea will face very difficult dilemma in choosing between the two.
Thank you. We have time for perhaps 2 last questions. Well, they were first. Sorry. Gentleman in the front, and then Kevin at the back.
I'm Henry Chen from Cambodia Center for Regional Studies. There's a school of thought in international relations that there is behind the national power of every country. They talk about technology and economic primacy. And as you mentioned, that China now is pushing very hard in the technology innovation side. And last year, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has published a list of 74 fourth-generation industrial revolution cutting-edge technology, and they named China to be ahead of the United States by huge margin. So how do you look at this technology revolution affecting the power equations between the two giants and the middle powers? Thank you.
Last question at the back.
Thank you, Professor. My name's Kevin. I'm from the US program here at RSIS. My question has to do with a few announcements that were made quite recently. Just this morning, for example, there was the announcement from the US Trade Representative's Office about Section 301 investigations into 16 new countries, including South Korea. And then beyond that, there's also the ongoing war in Iran, which is putting a lot of pressure on gas supplies throughout the region and hitting South Korea, among others, quite hard. How do you think these kind of pressures are going to affect the relationship in the short to medium term? Thank you.
Okay.
But I think there is time, because China and the United States will continue to pursue techno-nationalistic position, and their inclusion of middle power will be fundamentally limited. Therefore, I think the one important area of mutual cooperation among middle power is the area of technology. But they cannot come with all technologies. They've got to make a strategic niche in which they can promote cooperation. Particularly nowadays, Europeans are very much interested in pursuing technology cooperation with East Asian counterparts, particularly Japan and South Korea. Because European countries do not have an engineering capability which Japan and South Korea and Taiwan have. Therefore, they want to have cooperation. Therefore, likewise, ASEAN countries and Japan, South Korea, and others can find some kinds of niche areas through which they can promote cooperation. And I think middle power technological cooperation will be very, very important. And 301 and wine Tehran and wine Iran really is bad symptoms. It's what Antonio Gramsci called the morbid symptoms. It's just stupid. Okay, and I really I'm very pro-American. My son, daughter, 7 grandchildren, they are all American citizens. I want America really great again. But it's not the way to America to become great again. And I'm really worrisome. Then for the remaining 3 years, the U.S. will continue to undermine international order in that way. And we'll become we'll be suffering from collateral damages. But problem is nobody speak out to President Trump. Mark Carney made the statement. Now he's become very famous, but recently he also lowered his tail too. Therefore, I think there got to be some kind of collective voice against President Trump. It's not the way you go. Okay, otherwise we'll be suffering. It's a punishment for our silence. Okay, therefore we cannot complain about it.
Well, thank you, Prof. Moon, for your very reflective, thoughtful, and deep analysis of the topic of thinking the unthinkable. A region without U.S. support. Rather sobering overall, but certainly very practical, I would say, in terms of certain suggestions which the countries in our region can consider in terms of what we could potentially do going forward. And I would just like to end by reiterating some of your implications, which I agree with and are very perceptive. Number one, we just have to be prepared that perhaps, it's time for us to accept that even if we have a strategic scenario where Asia minus the US is not the end of the world. I mean, we have to think the unthinkable, as you say. Number two, countries in East Asia can be proactive and think about how to create a new security architecture. As we say, consider moving from collective defense to collective security. Number three, on the economic front, there's more that can be done. Open regionalism is a policy that can be further deepened and pursued. Number four, the importance, you reiterated the importance of strategic empathy and cultural pluralism, how we can sort of build this community going within the region going forward. And importantly, you see a great deal of additional scope for what you call middle power diplomacy. And I think these are very practical suggestions which could help countries in our region navigate the complexities going forward, given the Trump 2.0 administration and the impact on the global order. So with that, I think we've come to the end of our session. We ran out of time, but I'm sure you'll agree with me that Prof. Chung-In Moon has given us a rich masterclass in analysis of the global trends and what it means for all of us. So please join me in thanking him for his sharing with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Moon and Professor Kumar.